When I first opened the case file on John List, something about the man unsettled me in a way few criminals ever had. Not because he was brutal, though he was. Not because he was cold, though he certainly was that. What made my skin tighten was how ordinary he seemed. A man who blended so seamlessly into the fabric of American suburbia that even after committing one of the most meticulously planned family murders in the nation's history, he managed to vanish for nearly 2 decades without leaving behind even the echo of a footprint. On paper, his disappearance read like a magic trick. In reality, it was far more disturbing. It was the story of a man who had spent his whole life preparing to become invisible. To understand how a man kills his entire family and then walks into the world unnoticed, we must step inside the home where everything ended, the house in Westfield, New Jersey. A tall and stately Victorian mansion sitting on a quiet street, the kind of street where children ride bikes after school and mailmen know everyone by name. There was nothing unusual about the property itself. What made it unforgettable was the silence that settled over it in November of 1971. A silence so complete that neighbors began to feel uneasy without understanding why. A silence that outlived the family who once lived inside. I remember the first photograph I saw of the house, a large structure with dark windows and a wide porch, grand but strangely hollow. The kind of place that should feel warm with life, but instead radiated an eerie stillness, as though the walls themselves knew what had happened and refused to speak of it. The address was unmistakable. The residence where the List family once lived. The home where their lives were taken. And the home that for weeks stood brightly lit every night, even though no one inside was alive to flip a switch. When police finally entered the building in early December, responding to concerns that had grown too large to ignore, they stepped into cold air and the lingering scent of a refrigerator left unopened for too long. Every curtain was drawn, every light was on, and every room felt as though it had been abandoned, abruptly frozen in time. But it was the ballroom that told the true story. 4 bodies laid carefully side by side, covered with clean blankets, as if waiting for a final farewell that would never come. The soft hum of religious music played on repeat through the home's speaker system, turning the entire mansion into a disturbing chapel of the dead. The family members were identified quickly. Helene, the wife, Patricia, the teenage daughter, Frederick and John Jr., the sons. Upstairs, separate from the others, was the body of John's elderly mother, found on the 3rd floor. She had been too heavy to move, he would later admit, and so she remained where she fell. 5 lives, all extinguished by a single man who believed he had a righteous reason, a man who believed God himself would understand. When investigators traced what had happened that day, the level of planning bordered on clinical. John List had not snapped, he had not lost control. He moved with purpose. He killed early in the morning, targeting his wife first. Then he executed his mother, who likely never saw it coming. He cleaned the blood, waited for the children to return home from school one by one. His daughter Patricia arrived next, then his younger son Frederick. His oldest son, John Jr., returned much later. Evidence at the scene told investigators he had fought back. The carpet bore marks of struggle. The walls showed traces of repeated gunshots. It was the only moment where the murderer's mask had slipped even briefly. But once the killing was complete, List returned to control as though nothing had happened. He laid the bodies together. He called the children's schools and excused their future absences. He canceled mail delivery. He wrote a 5-page confession letter to his pastor explaining that he believed sending his family to heaven was better than letting them face the corruption of the world. The letter was rational, calculated, and chilling in its absence of remorse. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a guardian making an impossible decision. Then he walked out the door, locked it behind him, and drove away. The house that once carried laughter footsteps and dinner-table conversations slipped into stillness. Night after night, the lights glowed from every window, creating the illusion that life continued inside. But nothing continued. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. It was a mausoleum disguised as a home on a peaceful suburban street. As a detective reading these events decades later, I tried to imagine what kind of man could perform such orderly brutality. What kind of internal script drives a person to believe homicide is an act of mercy? I learned that List embodied a specific psychological profile, a despondent protector, a family annihilator who believes he is saving his loved ones from future suffering. The irony is that the suffering he feared was imagined, while the horror he inflicted was real. There is no sadness deeper than a father deciding he is the arbiter of life and death for the very people who trusted him unconditionally. In the days following the murders, investigators searched desperately for the man who had orchestrated such a monstrous act. But John List had prepared in ways few criminals do. He drained his bank accounts, destroyed photographs of himself so authorities would struggle to find a clear image, abandoned the family car in an airport parking lot to suggest that he might have flown somewhere far away, and most importantly, he cut all ties to his previous life with surgical precision. No friends he kept in touch with, no relatives he spoke to, no co-workers to wonder where he had gone. The man simply stepped out of his own identity like removing a coat. The case was broadcast nationwide, but nothing came of it. Psychics called with their visions. Citizens reported suspicious men living in their towns, but no lead ever solidified. In reality, List had already started a new life under a new name, living in a new state, attending a new church, and even remarrying. The killer had reinvented himself as an unremarkable man. A man who paid his taxes on time, attended potlucks, and greeted his neighbors politely. A man who left the darkness of his past buried inside a locked room that no one else would dare enter. Yet every case leaves behind a trail, even if faint. And for me, episode 1 of the John List investigation begins with the house itself. Not the crime, not the killer, but the house. Because before a man vanishes, the world he leaves behind must be studied piece by piece until its silence begins to speak. When I walk into a crime scene mentally, I stand first in the entryway of that mansion. I imagine the echo of my own breath in a space too large for the dead. I picture the staircase leading upward, the pathway John took as he moved from victim to victim. I feel the weight of each footstep he made as he climbed toward his mother's room. I let the stillness press against me like a second skin. Crime scenes are never just locations, they are emotional archives. They store fear, violence, and final moments in their walls. And this house was a cathedral of all three. By the time neighbors raised concern, the decomposition had already begun. Police described walking through cold corridors, encountering the smell of decay mixed with the faint sweetness of air fresheners scattered throughout the home. It was as though the killer had tried to mask death with domestic normalcy. But death cannot be masked. It permeates. It lingers. It transforms every object it touches into evidence. Investigators later found dinner plates set neatly in the sink as if the family had intended to share one more meal that never occurred. Coats hung by the door, shoes placed beside beds, school notebooks open on desks. These small remnants of daily life were devastating in their simplicity. It reminded everyone who walked through that house that the victims were not merely bodies. They were people who expected tomorrow to come. They had plans, routines, thoughts, conversations, all severed without warning by the person they trusted most. I believe that every act of evil leaves behind a question. In this case, the question is not how the murders occurred. That part is tragically clear. The question is why a man who built his life on religious rigidity and moral discipline believed killing his family was a moral solution. The answer lies partially in his financial desperation and his fear of humiliation, but those factors alone cannot explain the calculated nature of the crime. What we confront instead is a distortion of faith, a rationalization so powerful that it eclipsed empathy itself. As we close episode 1, the house remains my anchor. Because stories like this do not begin with the killer's capture or the moment justice is served. They begin with the silence left behind. They begin with the lights that stayed on for nearly a month, even though no living soul remained to need them. They begin with a community sensing something was wrong long before they understood the magnitude of what had occurred. This is where the investigation truly begins. With the quiet, with the empty rooms, with the ballroom that held 4 lives laid side by side, with the locked 3rd-floor bedroom where a mother's life ended before she could turn around, with the lingering hum of a religious hymn echoing through hallways that would never again hear voices. This is the first chapter of unraveling the mind of a man who believed he could vanish. The first step in piecing together the psychology of a man who thought murder was salvation. The first glimpse into the abyss he left behind. There is a moment in every investigation when the crime scene stops speaking and the trail shifts from what happened to where the killer has gone. In the case of John List, that moment came quickly. The house had told us everything it could. The bodies laid in the ballroom, the immaculate floors scrubbed of blood, the calm precision of each step he took. It all painted the portrait of a man who believed murder was not an eruption of chaos, but an orderly solution. Once those facts were established, one question consumed the investigation. Where does a man like that run to? To answer that, we have to walk with him as he left the home that had become a tomb. We have to retrace his steps not as detectives, but as shadows following very closely behind. Imagine the morning after the murders. The sky over Westfield was grey with the early light of November. John List finished his final tasks inside the house, adjusted the thermostat, turned on every remaining light, checked the locks, and stepped out of the front door as calmly as a man leaving for work. The car door shut, the engine turned over, and with that, the murderer drove away into a new existence. He did not speed. He did not look around nervously. The neighbors who might have glanced outside would have seen nothing strange. Just the quiet man next door. The one who never raised his voice, the one whose lawn was always perfectly trimmed, the one who walked with a stiff, disciplined posture, like he carried an invisible set of rules with him at all times. They would have never imagined that the man behind the wheel had left 5 dead bodies inside the glowing house. The car rolled down the street, turned onto the main road, and continued until the familiar town faded behind him. This was the moment where most killers begin to fall apart. Panic, adrenaline, fear of being caught. But John List was not most killers. His mind moved like a machine. He had thought through everything. The airport decoy, the money he withdrew from the bank, the documents he prepared, the name he had chosen. Even the way he kept his face neutral when passing through toll booths, understanding that cameras occasionally snapped photos. In the hours after the murders, he was already someone else. While investigators in Westfield struggled with the shock of the crime List was crossing state lines, he ditched the family's car in a parking lot at John F. Kennedy Airport. He deliberately left it where thousands of travelers left their vehicles, hoping police would assume he had boarded a plane for Europe. It was the kind of misdirection that only works when done quietly. He purchased no plane ticket, left no trace inside the terminal. He simply let the illusion speak for him. An empty car in an airport can imply everything and prove nothing. From there, he traveled by bus and train under assumed names until he reached his true destination, Colorado. A place far enough that no one from New Jersey would ever cross his path, yet ordinary enough that he could sink into the community without creating ripples. Colorado in the early 70s was a place where many people started over. New jobs, new relationships, new identities. John List understood that perfectly. He needed a place where a man with no past looked no different than everyone else. He began calling himself Robert Clark. He chose the name not because it was special, but because it wasn't. A name that could belong to any man in any town. A name that created no suspicion. In his new life, he rented a modest room, attended church, found work as an accountant, and slowly rebuilt the shell of the man he wanted others to see. He was quiet, polite, always early, always neatly dressed. He studied the habits of the people around him and imitated the ones that made him seem trustworthy. What makes this period of his life so unsettling is how seamlessly he adapted. A man who had meticulously executed his family was now sitting in church pews, shaking hands during Sunday greetings, bowing his head in prayer, singing hymns with a face that revealed none of the horrors he had committed. Investigators later learned that he even taught Sunday school standing before teenagers and speaking of moral conduct. The duplicity was staggering, yet no one around him saw anything unusual because he understood how to control every gesture and every word. For a long time, the case in New Jersey began to cool. There were no sightings, no credible tips, no financial activity. Nothing. It was as though List had not just fled but erased his own existence, and in many ways he had. The man was a ghost wrapped in the disguise of a functioning, responsible citizen. He changed jobs when necessary, moved to avoid attention, and kept every part of his life compartmentalized. No one ever got close enough to unravel the layers. Meanwhile, back in Westfield, investigators kept returning to the same question: what drove him to vanish with such precision? The deeper they looked into his personal history, the clearer it became that the disappearance was not an impulsive escape, but a lifelong rehearsal. John List grew up rigid, disciplined, and deeply afraid of failure. Humiliation was not merely uncomfortable for him. It was existential. When his finances collapsed and his career faltered, he viewed himself as a man cornered by shame. For someone else that might mean bankruptcy or divorce. For List, it meant extinction of the life he had built and the construction of a new one. His religious mindset complicated the psychology even further. In his confession letter, he insisted he had saved his family from damnation. The justification allowed him to eliminate the moral weight of murder. In his mind, he did not flee because he was guilty. He fled because he had completed a grim responsibility and now needed to step into a different role. In a disturbing sense, he saw himself as reborn, and rebirth requires shedding a previous identity entirely. This was why the case persisted in the minds of detectives long after the initial investigation stalled. It felt unfinished. It felt like a story interrupted. A man cannot simply murder 5 people and disappear into dust. There is always a flaw, a seam, a fracture in the mask. But for years, no fracture appeared. Each time the file resurfaced, investigators hit the same wall. No fingerprint surfaced. No credit history under his previous name. No sightings confirmed. He had buried his past so deeply that even the most determined searches came up empty. And while the country slowly forgot the name, the ghost continued to live quietly. In Colorado, Robert Clark became known as a dependable employee. He joined community groups. He made small talk about weather and local events. Eventually, he remarried. The new wife saw him as gentle, structured, and reliable. She never knew she was living with a man who had once laid the bodies of his family next to each other, as though arranging them for a portrait of death. What fascinates me as an investigator is the psychology of his reinvention. Most fugitives are running from the law. John List was running from himself. He didn't want thrill or escape. He wanted order. He wanted a life that matched the moral script he believed he deserved. He simply removed the people who interfered with that script, and when the world didn't fit him, he rewrote the world by stepping into a different version of himself. Through interviews with psychologists, detectives, and criminologists, a consistent pattern emerges. List was not a man who changed identities because he feared being caught. He changed identities because he could not tolerate the collapse of his old one. Identity to him was not fluid. It was sacred. If cracks formed, he didn't repair them. He abandoned the entire structure and built a new one somewhere else. And in that new structure, he ensured nothing would threaten it. No shame, no failure, no witnesses who remembered the man he once was. For 18 years, John List lived inside a lie so airtight that it became truth. He believed the lie. He breathed it. He wore it like skin. And the eerie part is how neither guilt nor conscience seemed to disturb him. There are accounts from co-workers who described him as calm, pleasant, and reliable. A man who brought homemade lunches, volunteered for extra shifts, and never raised his voice. It was as if the violent rupture of his past had simply been folded into a locked compartment in his mind. But the past has a way of finding the cracks. It seeps through like water slowly and persistently. And while List believed his transformation was perfect, the world was changing around him. Television was becoming a powerful investigative tool. Crime reconstruction was improving. Age progression techniques were being developed, and eventually one sculptor would create the chisel that fractured his illusion. But that moment belongs to another episode. For now, we remain in the years of his disappearance, tracing the man who blended so well into the fabric of his new life that neighbors assessed him as nothing more than polite, slightly stiff, and deeply private. They could never imagine that behind the glasses, the quiet voice and the neatly parted hair was a man who believed he had done God's work by killing his family. The story of John List's second life is not merely about escape. It is about the terrifying adaptability of the human mind. A mind that can divide itself into compartments so neatly that one can hold murder while the other holds prayer. A mind that can erase its footprints and convince itself that walking away from 5 bodies is not flight, but duty. As Tam Dan Miller files, I see the years of disappearance not as a void, but as a landscape of deliberate choices. Each step he took away from Westfield was calculated. Each new acquaintance was filtered. Each job was selected not for ambition, but for camouflage. And in that camouflage, he found exactly what he wanted in visibility. Episode 2 ends where his new life begins. The killer has erased himself. The man he becomes is accepted, trusted, and unremarkable. But beneath that surface lies the truth waiting to be unearthed, because even when a man walks out of his life, the life he abandoned walks after him like a shadow patient and inevitable. In the next episode, we will follow that shadow as it slowly catches up. For 18 years, the name John List drifted through law enforcement circles like a ghost story. It was spoken with equal parts frustration and disbelief. Detectives would lower their voices when discussing him not out of fear, but out of professional irritation, because no matter how skilled they were, no matter how many databases they searched or tips they chased, the man had outmaneuvered them. The case felt unsolvable, not because the killer was brilliant, but because he was ordinary enough to disappear among millions of ordinary faces. I've always believed that time is the most patient investigator. It waits for mistakes, for loose threads, for the small cracks in stories people build around themselves. and for nearly 2 decades, John List gave time nothing. His life as Robert Clark in Colorado was crafted with such precision that even those who interacted with him daily never glimpsed the fractures beneath the surface. But every lie, no matter how airtight, eventually meets the evolution of the world around it. Technology grows teeth, media expands its reach, tools evolve, and sometimes it is not the past that catches a fugitive, but the future. To understand how a man who hid for 18 years was finally found, we must turn to a show that revolutionized public involvement in criminal investigations, America's Most Wanted. When the program launched in 1988, it became more than entertainment. It was a national manhunt disguised as prime-time television. Its host presented stories with a mix of urgency and narrative drama that spoke directly to the American public, transforming viewers into millions of potential witnesses. And although the show did not know it yet, one of its greatest successes would be the capture of a ghost named John List. The producers were drawn to the case exactly because it felt impossible. A man murders his entire family, vanishes, and then remains hidden through years of technological and investigative advances. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea that a man like that could be sitting in a diner somewhere eating breakfast like the rest of us. Something unacceptable. So the show's team reached out to the detectives who had carried the burden of the case for almost 2 decades. The question the producers asked was simple: is there any way to show the public what John List might look like today? That question led them to a man whose skills sat somewhere between art and forensic science. Frank Bender, a sculptor known for his uncanny ability to reconstruct faces from minimal clues. Bender specialized in age progression work before the field even had a formal name. His gift was not merely technical accuracy, but psychological intuition. He didn't just recreate bones and muscles. He imagined who a person had become, not just physically, but emotionally. He studied behavior patterns and personality to predict how a fugitive would age. When the team presented the case to Bender, he studied every scrap of documentation available. Old photographs, witness descriptions, the confession letter, the psychological profile. He looked at the rigid posture, the neatly combed hair, the stiff jaw that suggested a lifetime of repressing emotion. Bender understood that age progression was not about adding wrinkles, but about forecasting the impact of personality on the body. And John List, with his controlled demeanor and strict habits, would age in a way that mirrored that rigidity. So Bender sculpted. He worked clay into the likeness of a man who had not been seen in 18 years. He added glasses, believing List would choose frames that conveyed respectability and authority. He gave the sculpture a slight narrowing around the mouth, the expression of someone who lived by strict rules. He added weight to the face, imagining a man who lived a conservative, stable routine. What emerged from the clay was not merely an aged version of a photograph. It was a prophecy. When the episode aired, millions of viewers across the country watched the reconstructed bust of John List rotate slowly on the screen. The host explained the crimes, the disappearance, and the extraordinary forensic artistry behind the sculpture. And then the phone lines opened. Callers from everywhere reported men they thought might be him. But among those calls was one that would change everything. A woman in Denver recognized the face immediately. She knew it not from news reports or old case files, but from the apartment complex where she lived. She had seen that face at community barbecues in the mailroom near the parking lot. Except the man she knew didn't call himself John List. He called himself Robert Clark. But the resemblance was so precise that she felt cold when she saw the sculpture. It wasn't similar. It was him. When she called the hotline, her voice shook. She explained that the man lived a quiet life, attended church, worked as an accountant, and was married. The agents on the other end listened carefully. It wasn't the first time a caller believed they had found a missing killer, but something in her precision, something in the calm certainty of her voice, made the investigators take notice. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all sat in his Colorado home, completely unaware that the world had just changed. For years he had believed himself erased. The broadcast was not on his radar. He did not imagine that a sculpture miles away could expose the identity he had held so carefully. But shadows have a way of catching up when the light finally hits them. FBI agents moved quietly. They gathered records. They checked employment documents. They pulled marriage licenses. The paper trail of Robert Clark was solid enough, but small inconsistencies began to appear when cross-referenced with older archives. The agents approached carefully, weaving together the threads until they formed a net. On June 1st, 1989, they knocked on his door. The man who answered was calm, soft-spoken, and unsuspecting. He looked exactly like Bender's sculpture. When the agents asked whether he was John List, he denied it. He insisted he was Robert Clark. But fingerprints do not lie, and the truth was sealed within the ridges of his hands. When they finally confronted him with evidence, he maintained the same restrained composure he had shown in all aspects of his life. He admitted who he was, but he did not express remorse. He spoke about salvation, about protecting his family, about fear of moral decay. His voice carried no tremor, no regret, only the certainty of a man who believed he had acted out of religious duty. What struck investigators most during these first interrogations was the absence of emotional conflict. Most fugitives captured after decades express panic, anger, despair, or at least the fatigue of being hunted. But John List appeared almost relieved, as though the end of his lie gave him permission to stop performing. His life as Robert Clark had been a shell he wore with discipline, but it was a costume nonetheless. When it finally cracked, he did not fight the collapse. He simply acknowledged it. The arrest made national headlines. And as the public compared Bender's sculpture to List's real face, the reaction was universal disbelief. The resemblance was extraordinary. Every crease, every contour, every detail matched. The sculptor had not only captured the man's appearance, but his essence. For investigators like me, this episode marks a turning point in understanding how a case thought to be impossible became solvable when art, science, and persistence intertwined. It reminds us that fugitives do not escape the future. They merely postpone it. Episode 3 ends at the moment the mask finally shattered. After 18 years of silence, the face that tried to stay hidden was pulled into the light. And in the next chapter, we will descend into the courtroom where the man who believed he acted for God faced the judgment of men. When the door closed behind the agents and the man once known as John List found himself in custody, it marked the end of one life and the unmasking of another. Yet what struck every investigator present was not fear or desperation, but the startling calmness in his eyes. It was as though he had simply returned to a long-paused routine rather than been apprehended after 18 years of deception. That composure would follow him into every interrogation room, every pre-trial meeting, and finally into the courtroom where the world would watch a man confront the consequences he had spent nearly 2 decades avoiding. The trial that unfolded was not merely a legal process. It was a confrontation between the life he had lived and the lives he had ended. In the months leading up to the proceedings, the prosecution worked meticulously to reconstruct the crime with cold precision. The photographs of the ballroom, the positions of the bodies, the bullet trajectories, the timeline he had engineered with such deliberation. Every detail he tried to erase was brought back into the light. But unlike many defendants confronted with decades of buried evidence, he did not react with panic. He observed quietly sometimes with a faint, unreadable expression as though studying the case of another man entirely. The courtroom filled with journalists, true crime writers, local residents, and individuals who had followed the mystery since 1971. What captivated them was the disconnect between the brutality of the act and the gentleness of the man standing trial. He entered wearing tidy glasses, a modest suit, shoulders held stiffly, hands folded neatly. There was nothing in his posture to suggest violence, nothing in his manner to suggest the horrors he orchestrated. Prosecutors later said this contrast made the case both compelling and profoundly disturbing. Evil does not always snarl. Sometimes it sits quietly with its shirt tucked in. When opening statements began, the prosecution framed the case simply: a man murdered his wife, his children, and his mother in a calculated act, driven not by madness but by pride, financial desperation, and a distorted belief that he alone had the authority to decide their fate. They emphasized the planning, the deception, the cold execution of each killing. They showed the jurors the carefully written confession letter where he claimed spiritual justification for the murders. The language in that letter struck many in the courtroom. It carried no sorrow, no fear, only certainty. He wrote as though explaining an unfortunate but necessary administrative decision. The defense took a different approach. They spoke of psychological strain, emotional collapse, religious delusion. They tried to paint him not as a monster, but as a man who had snapped under unbearable pressures. They described his troubled marriage, the financial crisis he hid from everyone around him, the feeling of spiritual doom he believed hovered over his home. In their narrative, the killings were an act of deranged mercy, but even as they spoke, observers sensed a fundamental tension. There was no madness in the man seated beside them, only order. Only control, only a chilling, precise quiet. Throughout the testimony, he sat with the same rigid posture he had carried through his life. He did not weep, he did not tremble. He took notes occasionally, his handwriting neat and consistent. Witnesses described the shock they felt when the crimes were discovered and the disbelief that someone like him could commit such acts. Teachers spoke of the bright futures of the children. Neighbors recalled the eerie stillness of the house, the lights burning every night, the growing unease that eventually pushed them to call authorities. Each testimonial piece built the atmosphere of the world he destroyed, a world the jury needed to understand. When the prosecution displayed the photographs, the room held its breath. The images of the ballroom, the blankets covering the bodies, the lifeless hands resting neatly at their sides. The jurors looked shaken. Some closed their eyes, but he did not look away. He stared at the images with the same expression he wore during his arrest, composed, slightly distant, as though he were revisiting an old task rather than confronting the devastation he created. What fascinated many reporters was not just his lack of remorse, but the way he spoke when he finally testified. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, but not in the sense of guilt. It was the tone of someone explaining a spreadsheet, someone clarifying a misunderstood detail in a policy. He repeated that he believed his family was drifting away from spiritual purity, that poverty loomed, that he feared moral corruption. He insisted he acted to save them. He used the word necessary more than once. Necessary, as if necessity were a shield stronger than law or conscience. The prosecution cross-examined him with precision. They asked why he did not seek help, why he did not pursue counseling, financial assistance, or divorce, why his solution involved bullets rather than conversation. Each question peeled away his rationale, exposing the underlying truth: he acted not out of altruism, but out of fear of humiliation. He admitted indirectly that he could not face the shame of failure. His beliefs about salvation became intertwined with his terror of public disgrace, forming a justification that served him more than his family. When the final day of testimony arrived, the courtroom was silent. The jury deliberated for hours, though many believed the verdict had been sealed long before. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession explicit, the motive clear enough, even in its warped logic. But what lingered in the minds of most observers was the emotional void. A man capable of executing his own children without a flicker of regret sits apart from ordinary human understanding. That void itself became part of the evidence. When the jury returned, he listened intently but without visible emotion. Guilty on all counts. 5 murders, 5 extinguished lives, 5 verdicts delivered with the solemnity appropriate for a crime that defied comprehension. He nodded once, a small gesture that could not be deciphered. Relief, perhaps, or resignation, or simply acknowledgement that the performance of Robert Clark was over and the life he had abandoned in 1971 had finally caught up with him. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, the maximum penalty possible at the time. He was led away in handcuffs, walking with the same posture he carried through every chapter of his story, straight-backed, restrained, almost formal. The courtroom watched in a stunned kind of silence, not because justice had been denied or delayed, but because the man being escorted away did not resemble their idea of a killer. He resembled an accountant heading to a quiet office to complete unfinished paperwork. That disconnect would haunt the public imagination for years. It challenged the myth that evil wears a recognizable face. It reminded everyone who followed the trial that monstrous acts often emerge not from chaos, but from calm, deliberate hands. And it cemented the case as one of the most chilling examples of concealed darkness in American criminal history. Episode 4 ends with the door of the courtroom closing behind him, but the story does not end there. In the next chapter, we explore the aftermath, the cultural shock, the psychological implications, and the lingering question that has followed the case for decades. How does a man live with such a crime, and what happens to the world left behind? In every investigation, there comes a moment, not when the case ends, but when it settles. The noise fades, the courtroom empties, the headlines are replaced by new crises, new tragedies, new obsessions. And yet some cases continue to pulse beneath the surface of collective memory. Not because of the violence alone, but because of the unsettling questions left behind. The story of the man once known to America as a missing family annihilator is one of those cases. Even after the verdict, the sentence, and the slow passing of years, the echoes of his acts never truly stilled. The aftermath of his trial unfolded like a cultural autopsy. Journalists, psychologists, criminologists, and ordinary citizens all attempted to make sense of how someone so outwardly disciplined, so methodical, so apparently unremarkable, could commit an act so calculated and devoid of empathy. The crime forced the public to confront a disturbing truth that evil can reside not in chaos, but in order, not in fury, but in quiet conviction. In the weeks following the sentencing, newspapers across the country printed stories not just about the trial, but about the man he had become during his years in hiding. Neighbors from Colorado expressed shock that the polite accountant who attended church and joined community events had once wiped away the traces of blood from his own family's final moments. The dissonance was almost too great for many to comprehend. How could a man build a second life with such composure? How could he carry the weight of what he had done while speaking softly, shaking hands, and bowing his head in prayer? That question fascinated me as an investigator. Because cases like this aren't simply about guilt, they are about the structure of the human mind. The ability to compartmentalize is something everyone does to some degree. But in this man it existed in an extreme form, a psychological partition reinforced by decades of rigid self-control. He didn't merely hide his past from the world. He buried it within himself and sealed the door. As psychologists analyzed him, a pattern emerged. He was not driven by impulse, nor by sadistic pleasure, nor by delusion in the clinical sense. His violence came from a place of absolute certainty, a belief that his moral framework justified acts that defied humanity. And once he completed what he believed was necessary, he simply continued walking forward. In his mind, the killings were not a rupture. They were a correction, one that allowed him to move on unburdened. This psychological landscape troubled experts deeply. It raised the question of how many people walk through life with private frameworks of belief so rigid they could warp under pressure. It forced society to consider the terrifying possibility that a calm demeanor can hide catastrophic potential. The case became a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ideology, silent despair, and emotional isolation. But beyond academic analysis, there were the human ripples. Relatives of the victim struggled for years to reconcile the man they once knew with the murderer he had become. Some found closure in the conviction. Others never did. They spoke in interviews about the warmth of the children, about the laughter that once filled the home that later became a mausoleum. For them, the trial did not bring peace. It merely confirmed what they already knew, that some parts of life shatter so completely they cannot be pieced together again. The house in Westfield, long empty after the murders, became a symbol. Residents passed by in silence. Children whispered stories about it. For a while, it seemed like the structure absorbed the weight of what had happened within its walls. Eventually, it was sold, renovated, and lived in again. Yet I've always believed that buildings remember, not in a supernatural sense, but in the way their presence lingers. Even transformed, the house held a shadow, a reminder of how tragedy can cling to a place even after fresh paint and new furniture attempt to overwrite it. As for the man at the center of it all, he spent the remaining years of his life in prison. Even there, his demeanor remained unchanged, polite, quiet, controlled. He read the Bible, followed routines, and avoided confrontation. He once said in an interview that he hoped for divine forgiveness, that he believed God understood his intentions. When asked whether he regretted what he had done, he answered with words that have troubled me since I first read them. He regretted the consequences, not the actions. In those few words lay the truth of who he was. He died in custody, leaving behind a legacy that neither fades nor fits cleanly into any category. Not insanity, not passion, not desperation alone, but something colder, something that forces us to confront the unsettling spectrum of human rationality. The case endures not because of its violence, but because of its logic, a logic so twisted it resembled sanity. As I reflect on this case, I think back to the first time I saw the photograph of the house where it all began. The stillness, the windows darkened by secrets, the quiet street that held no hint of the horror within. And now, after the trial, the revelations, and the long years of analysis, the same image returns to me with a different weight. It reminds me that evil often hides in forms we least expect, in silence, in order, in the routines of a man who seemed incapable of rage. This final chapter is not about closure, because there can be none in cases like this. It is about recognition. Recognition that beneath the calmest surfaces may lie storms unseen. Recognition that vigilance is not paranoia, but awareness. Recognition that justice, though delayed, can still reclaim what was lost to time. As Tam Dan Miller files, I leave this case with a sense of solemnity. Not because the story is over, but because its echoes will never fully fade. They linger in the questions we continue to ask, in the fears we rarely speak aloud, and in the fragile understanding we have of the human mind. What remains after the silence is not peace but memory, And memory once awakened does not rest.